At 6:10 a.m. on December 5th, 2025, the shoreline near the Temryuk energy terminal on the Sea of Azov looked like any other industrial morning until $650 million in gas and steel did not merely burn, but ceased to exist in a chain of detonations that unfolded in roughly 140 seconds. The visual signature was impossible to mistake. A towering fireball described as 2.5 miles high, visible from Crimea, followed by tank ruptures that turned the harbor into a bright white void on every surviving camera feed. The important part is what came before that flash, because the strike was engineered to feel like an accident right up until physics forced the truth into the open. 48 hours earlier, a separate action set the table without touching the terminal itself. A Ukrainian F-16 strike disrupted a rail line, and more importantly, the rhythm of Russian command and control in the region. In the hours that followed, S-400 batteries began scanning for jets with the urgency of crews expecting a second wave, while patrol boats were pulled toward the Kerch Bridge and underwater sensor nets were left damaged or degraded. Nothing about that shift looked catastrophic on paper, but it created a familiar problem in modern defense. The same radar that watches the sky cannot also watch the water with equal attention, and the same crews cannot be everywhere at once. At 4:20 a.m., the Sea of Azov was a flat black surface with no moonlit drama, just the quiet background of shipping routes and sleepy operators. On a Russian scope near Temryuk, a contact labeled as the Star of Monrovia slid along at about 12 knots, a Liberian-flagged grain ship presenting the kind of profile that rarely triggers alarms. 15,000 tons of steel, supposedly hauling winter wheat to Turkey, is the sort of story that fits neatly into a radar screen's limited imagination. The deception did not rely on invisibility, it relied on normalcy, because radar can tell you where something is, not what it truly intends to do once it arrives. At 4:25 a.m., when the ship was roughly 22 meters from the intended release point, the plan stopped being shipping and became choreography. Cargo doors on the Star of Monrovia opened just above the waterline, and gravity did the quiet work that engines did not need to announce. 6 Magura or Mura 5 unmanned surface vessels splashed into freezing water in a sequence that looked like discarded equipment rather than an attack. They were not the familiar single-purpose suicide boats that defenders had learned to anticipate. They were motherships, built to carry something else, and the difference mattered more than speed or stealth. Each Mura carried a custom-built flight deck on its top surface, holding 4 13-inch FPV quadcopters with folded rotors and shaped charges intended for tank-killing effects. Alongside those airborne munitions, each mothership also carried its own main warhead, turning 6 boats into a package of roughly 30 separate munitions once launched. That arithmetic was the first unpleasant surprise for any defender thinking in terms of one threat at a time. A strike team can be stopped by a single good gun. A swarm changes the question from accuracy to endurance, because the defender must be perfect repeatedly, while the attacker only needs one opening. The second surprise was not explosive, but electrical. Bolted to the stern of the motherships was a spool of fiber optic cable, about 7.5 miles of glass wire thinner than a human hair, feeding live video back to Odessa. Russian Murmansk BN jammers can saturate radio spectrum with noise, but fiber optics do not listen to radio waves. In the simplest terms, it is difficult to shout through a window and expect the light inside to flicker. For the first phase, the control link was effectively shunted to the electromagnetic battlefield, and that silence delayed detection longer than any coating or low-profile hull could have. For the first hour, the 6 Mura motherships ghosted through the water at about 20 knots, their fiber optic connection steady as it carried video and control signals without advertising itself. Then, about 12 miles out, the physics of the plan imposed a hard limit. Spools ran empty, and as the last length of cable snapped free, the system automatically switched to a backup link, a localized, encrypted mesh network carried by radio waves. That shift kept the swarm alive, but it also made it audible. Glass becomes air, and air becomes detectable, and detection turns a carefully staged ambush into a race. The first wave leveled off the low, described as about 200 feet, racing toward the patrol ships at high speed with a simple mission: blind the ships by killing radars and gun directors. The Kotov opened fire with the AK-630, a system that can throw thousands of rounds per minute, and the sky filled with tracers and shredded air. The lead drone vaporized before it could correct its line. Another tried to break away and lost its rotors in the shrapnel field. For a few seconds, the exchange looked one-sided, as if a disciplined crew with a reliable gun could erase the swarm through volume alone. But swarms do not require elegance. They require pressure. While the Kotov kept its bow pointed toward the most obvious approach, maximizing radar coverage and gun arcs, two drones dropped lower to wave top height, slipping under the radar's depression angle where the geometry of the sensor creates a blind band close to the surface. The gunners did not see them until it was too late to matter. One drone slammed into a bridge wing and punched through steel plating with its shaped charge, not sinking the ship, but killing the fire control director. The effect was immediate. The main gun fell silent, not from damage to barrels, but from blindness. With the director gone, another drone ignored the hull and drove straight at the rear deck, where a Panzer module was bolted in place. The drone struck the missile tubes, and the secondary explosion turned a high-value air defense component into a violent, bright failure. The narrative value of that moment is not the dollar figure attached to the hardware, though it is described as roughly $15 million. The value is that it demonstrates a method. Remove the eyes, then remove the shield, and the rest of the formation becomes vulnerable, regardless of armor. Out of 8 drones, only a few survived the approach, but the patrol ship was now drifting, burning, and crucially unable to control the fight. The second wave of 8 FPV drones crossed the coastline with a mission that was more strategic than dramatic. Hit foam pumping stations and specialized fire trucks, because without foam, an LNG fire becomes difficult to control. But the defenders were ready, and readiness changes the geometry of survival. 23mm high explosive shells created a curtain that forced drones into evasive paths through industrial pipes and metal structures. Wind tunnels around massive storage tanks shoved lightweight frames offline at the worst possible moments, turning precision into near misses. Shotgun buckshot shredded delicate rotors, and an Igla airburst used the heat of battery packs as enough of a target to knock multiple drones from the sky. And Odessa had to decide whether to accept failure or force a final move that would depend on seconds rather than minutes. In Odessa, the command room did not erupt in panic, but the atmosphere tightened into something colder. The failure of the second wave did not invalidate the plan. It simply revealed which assumptions were wrong. The foam system was damaged but alive. The guns were still firing, and the shoreline defenders were now locked into a rhythm of detection and response. That rhythm was the vulnerability. Static defenses work best when threats behave predictably, and the swarm had not yet done the one thing the defenders expected most, which was to arrive one by one and politely. The order that followed was brief and heavy with intent. Send the final wave, a hive, do not miss. At around 6 a.m., the visual feed from the coast looked like a furnace viewed through glass. Zu-23 two guns poured continuous streams of 23mm high explosive shells into the water, creating a splash zone that no small craft could survive for long. The instinctive response would have been to scatter and hunt targets individually, but that instinct belonged to the earlier layers. This phase required something else. The FPV drones were switched to what operators described as breacher protocol, a mode that accepted loss as function. The goal was not to destroy guns directly, but to force human crews to flinch, duck, and lose seconds. The final wave of 8 FPV drones launched from the backs of the charging Mura motherships and formed a tight wedge in front of them, a configuration that looked wasteful until you understood the math. Small warheads detonated in airbursts several meters ahead of gun pits, not to block bullets, which physics does not allow, but to create shockwaves and blinding flashes that interrupt muscle memory. On the shore, a gunner depressed his pedal and sent fire toward the lead boat, only to recoil instinctively as a drone burst in front of his position. For about 5 heartbeats, the wall of lead stopped. 5 seconds is nothing in planning, but everything in motion. 2 drones broke formation and dove straight down the barrels of the guns. Their charges were small, not designed to shatter steel mounts, but steel does not need to be destroyed to be abandoned. Shrapnel rattled shields, crews ducked again, and another brief pause opened in the fire. This pattern repeated across positions, buying not safety, but timing. While the surface fight consumed attention, a quieter disaster was unfolding inside the facility itself, seeded by the earlier damage that seemed inconsequential. Diesel from the damaged fuel truck had leaked into cable trenches beneath the main control room, and fumes accumulated where they were not expected. As firing resumed outside, a stray tracer round found its way into that invisible hazard. The ignition did not announce itself with a dramatic explosion. It crept through confined space and did the kind of damage that alarms cannot reverse. Hydraulic control lines for emergency shutdown valves were severed by heat, and inside the control room, boards flipped from green to red in an instant. Valve failure. Pressure critical. The station commander shouted for manual override, but the decision had already moved from human hands to material limits. Valves overhead were stuck open, and what flowed through them could not be persuaded to stop. FPV drones exploited the opening with a precision that did not require awareness of the internal failure. Their targets were the loading arms, massive articulated steel pipes connecting storage tanks to the pier, carrying liquefied natural gas at minus 62 degrees Celsius. One drone was clipped by small arms fire and spun uselessly into the sea, but another struck cleanly. Its shaped charge punched a precise hole through the cryogenic steel, and the result was not fire but transformation. Liquid gas met humid air and boiled instantly, expanding hundreds of times in volume into a dense white cloud that rolled outward and downward like fog with intent. That cloud was not yet burning, and that was the danger. Heavier than air, it spread across the tarmac and into low spaces, a fuel air bomb waiting for a spark. At approximately 6:05 a.m., the remaining Mura motherships surged forward at roughly 48 miles per hour, their pilots flying by GPS and instinct, because cameras could no longer see through the vapor. On the shore, defenders fired blindly into whiteness, more afraid of what they could not see than what they could. An RPG found one boat by chance, detonating it 200 yards from shore in a blast that cracked windows but did not yet touch the terminal. Another boat struck a submerged concrete block and tore itself open, sinking before it could contribute. 4 boats remained, and with them, the core of the plan. 2 aimed not at tanks, but at the concrete pier supports beneath manifold pipes. Their 300-pound class warheads detonated almost simultaneously, collapsing the pier and shearing the pipes above. Thousands of tons of liquefied gas poured directly into the harbor, turning water into a boiling field of explosive vapor. The geometry of the site now worked against itself because containment depends on structure, and structure was gone. The final Mura did not target pipes at all. Its pilot aimed for ignition. At full throttle, the boat drove onto the rocky embankment and launched into the air, a brief, impossible arc that ended inside the electrical substation powering the pumps. The 660-pound warhead vaporized the substation on impact, and arcing electricity met the rolling gas cloud. What followed was described as a thermal event rather than an explosion, because it involved the atmosphere itself catching fire. A fireball rose into the dawn, 2.5 miles high, and an overpressure flattened trucks and crews without warning. The heat exceeded 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, enough to melt steel skins on the main storage tanks. Inside, liquefied gas boiled violently, pressure climbed past design limits, and the sequence became inevitable. A BLEV, a boiling liquid expanding vapor explosion, ruptured one tank, then another, then another. a chain reaction that sliced through the facility like a plasma cutter. Infrastructure valued at $650 million did not burn so much as change state, leaving nothing solid where there had been steel moments before. In Odessa, screens went white. Signals died not because of jamming, but because the drones, the boats, the cameras, and the harbor itself no longer existed in a form that could transmit data. Silence followed, broken only by the understanding that the operation had moved beyond observation. When the sun rose over the Sea of Azov, the Temryuk terminal was not damaged. It was erased. Fires burned for 3 days and 3 nights, visible from Crimea, fed by the absence of foam and the presence of fuel. When the smoke thinned enough for satellites to see through it, the scale of loss became measurable rather than theoretical. Roughly 70% of the region's export capacity had been reduced to molten steel and fractured concrete, not because of a single massive weapon, but because dozens of small systems were sequenced to force failure at the worst possible moments. The fires did not rage because fuel was abundant alone, but because response was surgically delayed. Fire trucks that should have formed foam blankets were disabled or forced back, and pumping systems that should have isolated tanks were rendered useless by severed control lines. What burned for 3 days was not just gas, but time. The official response from Moscow arrived quickly and sounded carefully narrow. The event was described as an electrical short circuit, an industrial accident amplified by stored energy. That explanation worked on paper, but not on screens. Civilian videos flooded messaging channels, showing dozens of distinct flashes and sequential detonations that did not resemble a single cascading failure. People who live near industrial plants understand what accidents look like, and this did not fit the pattern. Reliability is a currency in energy markets, and when explanations collapse under amateur analysis, that currency devalues faster than infrastructure can be rebuilt. Direct damage was estimated at $650 million, a figure that captured tanks, pipes, and terminals, but not absence. Each day the terminal remained offline represented roughly $3 million in lost revenue, a bleed that compounds quietly. Energy buyers care less about intent than delivery, and a supplier who cannot guarantee shipments becomes a risk regardless of price. The strike did not just remove capacity, it injected doubt into contracts that depend on predictability. In that sense, the economic effect extended far beyond the blast radius, reaching boardrooms and insurance tables that never appear on maps. From a military perspective, the operation forced an uncomfortable accounting. Ukraine demonstrated that it could project force at sea without a traditional navy by turning unmanned surface vessels into launch platforms for airborne munitions. The phrase miniature aircraft carrier sounds dramatic, but the concept is simpler and more troubling. By decoupling air power from runways and ships from pilots, the attack collapsed categories defenders rely on. Coastal waters that had been treated as buffers became approach lanes, and assets once considered safe because they were not on the front line suddenly required protection. That requirement creates a dilemma that cannot be solved by addition alone. Air defense systems are finite, crews are finite, and attention is finite. Protecting economic assets along the coast demands resources that would otherwise reinforce frontline units. Choosing not to protect them invites further economic damage. The choice is not between offense and defense, but between different kinds of loss. Every Zu-23-2 truck or missile battery repositioned to guard a terminal is one less system covering troops elsewhere, and the attacker does not need to announce which pressure point will be touched next. The return on investment underscored the imbalance. Approximately $4.5 million in drones, boats, and munitions destroyed assets valued at $650 million without counting downstream effects. That ratio matters because it shapes behavior. When low-cost systems can impose high-cost outcomes, deterrence based on expense loses credibility. It becomes less about who can afford more, and more about who can think in layers. The operation rewarded integration, patience, and an understanding that physics and economics enforce their own rules regardless of doctrine. There is also a human lesson buried beneath the strategic language. Crews on patrol ships did what they were trained to do, firing accurately and aggressively until their sensors failed. Shore defenders adapted with shotguns and missiles, using whatever tools fit the moment. Control room operators tried to respond to alarms as systems went red. None of those actions were irrational. The failure was not courage or competence, but mismatch. Systems designed to stop single threats were overwhelmed by many small ones arriving in sequence, each forcing a different response until responses conflicted. The timing of the strike amplified that effect. By waiting until defenses were already strained by earlier actions, the attackers did not need to defeat every layer. They needed only to exploit the seams between them. Rail disruption forced air defenses to look up. Patrol redeployments pulled sensors away from water. Jamming focused on radio, while fiber optics carried commands silently. When fiber ended and radio began, the detection that followed arrived seconds too late to restore equilibrium. Modern defense often assumes warnings arrive early enough to matter. This time, they did not. Another overlooked aspect is visibility. The fireball rising 2.5 miles into the sky was not just a physical phenomenon, but a signal. It told observers across the region that distance does not guarantee safety. It told shipping insurers that proximity matters less than predictability. It told planners that industrial geography can become a liability when it concentrates value. Visibility is a form of messaging that does not require translation, and in this case, it spoke louder than any statement released afterward. The operation also highlighted how quickly narratives form in the absence of clarity. Within hours, competing explanations circulated, some technical, some conspiratorial, some dismissive. The abundance of amateur footage made consensus harder to control. In earlier eras, a single official briefing might have shaped understanding for days. Here, analysis began before statements were written, and the gap between what people saw and what they were told widened. For a state that relies on centralized messaging, that gap is itself a vulnerability. None of this suggests the end of traditional naval or air power. Large ships and jets still matter in many contexts. What changed is the baseline. Defenders must now assume that small, cheap, networked systems can coordinate across domains with surprising effectiveness. Attackers do not need to win outright. They need to complicate defense until one overlooked interaction cascades. In that environment, resilience depends as much on redundancy and dispersion as on firepower. The strike near Temryuk is best understood not as a single event, but as a prototype. It combined surface, air, electronic, and informational elements into a sequence that punished rigid assumptions. It showed how unmanned systems can act as both weapons and decoys, how control links can shift modes mid-mission, and how secondary effects like bow pressure and human reaction can be as decisive as explosives. Prototypes invite iteration, and iteration rarely favors the side that assumes the first example was unique. Looking forward, the implications extend beyond liquefied natural gas terminals. Oil tankers, ports, and other high-value maritime assets share similar characteristics: concentrated energy, complex safety systems, and dependence on timely response. A 120,000-ton tanker in open water presents different challenges, but the underlying logic remains. If control, sensing, and response can be desynchronized, scale becomes less protective than expected. The question is not whether such methods will be attempted again, but where and how defenses will adapt. The morning of December 5th, 2025 will likely be remembered less for the exact number of drones or the height of the fireball, and more for the way it reframed cost, risk, and access. It demonstrated that waiting can be as powerful as striking, and that patience paired with integration can turn industrial strength against itself. When the harbor disappeared from screens, it marked the end of one facility and the beginning of a new set of assumptions about what modern conflict looks like at the edge of land and sea. At 4:30 a.m. on September 24th, 2025. The port of Novorossiysk is operating under the comforting fiction of routine, with the remnants of Russia's Black Sea Fleet tucked against the piers, as if concrete and distance can substitute for defense. And in that quiet, the most dangerous thing is not what the sailors can see, but what their screens think they see. Because the entire operation is built on a single premise that turns modern air defense into a guessing game. Force the defender to look everywhere at once, and the defender becomes blind in every direction at the same time. From the west, 6 AQ-400 Scythe drones are already committed to their approach, skimming so low that their flight path is defined by wave tops and shoreline curvature, roughly 90 miles per hour, with only about 50 feet of clearance, a profile chosen not for speed, but for absence, because long-range radar is strongest when it can see over the horizon. And these drones are not trying to outrun detection. They are trying to never appear as a coherent object until it is too late to build a firing solution. From the south, 3 Magura V5 unmanned boats cut through the swells toward the harbor, the kind of surface threat that makes defensive doctrine feel reassuring right up until the moment it becomes a choice between bad options, with 2 boats carrying 700-pound warheads meant for catastrophic impact, and the third broadcasting a deliberately loud identity, electronically declaring itself a friendly patrol craft. A performance designed to be noticed because a decoy that is ignored is not bait, and bait only works when the predator lunges. 200 miles away, a Ukrainian operator watches the geometry tighten through the thermal feed of a Bayraktar TB2, loitering at roughly 27,000 feet, high enough to treat fog as a thin layer and low enough to keep persistent eyes on the harbor, with targeting data moving through a Starlink connection that turns distance into a minor inconvenience, and his crosshairs are not wandering across the waterfront, but settled on the center of gravity of the entire narrative. The Admiral Makarov, described as a $500 million frigate carrying 8-caliber cruise missiles. The intent is not simply to score a hit. It is to convert the Russian defensive network into an overworked switchboard, where every contact demands attention and every classification choice carries risk. Because the drones in the air and the boats on the sea are timed to arrive as a single problem with multiple answers. And the moment the defenders commit to one answer, the other becomes decisive. This is why the operation is framed as a hybrid ghost strike, not because the weapons are invisible, but because the decision process becomes haunted by uncertainty. At 4:38 a.m. local time, 7 minutes after the attack begins, the first alarm tears across the command post when the Podsolnuk coastal radar reports a contact that looks satisfyingly obvious. A thick signal roughly 50 miles out, closing fast with a radar cross-section described as around 110 square feet. The kind of return that resembles a patrol boat and invites a clean response. And the Panzer S1 battery responds the way systems are built to respond, by trusting the clarity of the picture it has been given. In the next few seconds, 857 E-6E missiles are launched toward that signal at roughly Mach 3, and the decoy Magura boat obliges by dying loudly, vaporizing in an orange flash and throwing a tall plume of salt water into the air, the kind of satisfying kill that makes operators feel in control, except the satisfaction is part of the trap, because the whole point of the decoy was to consume missiles, attention and confidence, while the real threats continued closing under a different set of rules. At that exact moment, a secondary Kasta 2E2 radar, tuned for low-altitude targets, begins to register faint returns from the west. 6 small anomalies at about 50 feet. But in the fog and sea clutter, those returns resemble the kind of noise that well-designed filters are meant to dismiss. And this is where sophistication becomes a liability, because the Panzer is optimized to track fighter aircraft and cruise missiles, not tiny drones with cross-sections described as around 1 square foot, flickering in and out of certainty like birds. Russian gunners take the larger picture at face value, choosing the targets that look most dangerous on their screens. and another salvo of 4 missiles is fired into the inflated chaff clouds, which obligingly vanish in paired fireballs. But the exchange rate is already turning, because the defenders have burned through a significant portion of their ready-to-fire missiles while destroying almost nothing of real value, and the story emphasizes the arithmetic of depletion as much as the drama of explosions. The cost to Ukraine is not erased. One scythe flying low is caught by shrapnel and disintegrates, proving the defenses are still lethal when geometry aligns. Yet the broader pattern remains. Expensive interceptors are being spent to erase ghosts, and the radar net is being bent into misclassification, which creates the opening for the next phase that is not about metal at all, but about signals. As a Krasuka 4 electronic warfare system powers up with the intention of turning every smart drone into a dumb brick. At 4:40 a.m. local time, the Krasuka 4 unleashes a wide storm of electromagnetic energy, described as reaching roughly 186 miles across. And the immediate effect is sensory and brutal. The video feeds from the surviving sites collapse into static, warning indicators flash signal loss, and one drone, now flying blind, lurches toward a wave as if the air itself has become unreliable, while the Russians attempt GPS spoofing, feeding false satellite data meant to convince the drones they are nowhere near Novorossiysk at all. The script frames this counter as a race in milliseconds, with the Krasuka's analysis and response lag described at around 100 milliseconds, while Ukrainian onboard decision cycles are described at roughly 50 milliseconds. A timing gap that matters only because the drones can switch modes, and the operator uses that opening to push them into inertial navigation and autonomous control, relying on internal gyroscopes and preloaded terrain maps, a shift that turns the drones from remotely flown tools into guided objects that can keep moving even when the sky becomes electronically hostile. The shift works because the drones were never meant to be flown like model aircraft once inside the harbor defense bubble. And as the electronic storm rages below, the Bayraktar alone remains unaffected enough to function as the conductor, its sensors slicing through the interference to identify the source of the jamming itself. A single truck-mounted antenna array, whose emissions are now visible as a kind of negative space against the background noise. And the operator is forced into a choice that defines the entire middle act of the operation. One scythe drone is peeled away from the formation and reassigned as a weapon against the jammer rather than the fleet, an exchange rate that looks unfavorable in isolation but makes sense when measured against the value of restoring command and control. And that drone becomes a 154-pound guided projectile aimed not at steel hulls, but at the nervous system of the defense, streaking toward the Krasuka antenna with purpose rather than finesse. The impact is described without sentimentality, a flash of light where the truck had been, millions of dollars of electronic warfare hardware erased by something that costs a fraction of that amount. And with the jammer gone, the remaining scythes regain clarity, their feeds snapping back into focus. But the reprieve is brief, because the Russian defensive architecture is layered, and the next layer is already waking up in response to the sudden silence. As the Krasuka goes dark, its larger counterpart, the Murmansk BN system, activates with a broader, cruder reach, projecting a massive spoofing field that succeeds where finesse failed. And one of the remaining scythes drifts 2 miles off course, lost to the mission, not through destruction but through confusion, leaving 3 operational drones to carry the burden forward, and narrowing the margin for error with every second that passes. At 4:41 a.m. local time, the Russians abandon subtlety and turn to pursuit, launching 3 Orion reconnaissance and strike drones from a nearby coastal airfield, aircraft designed specifically to hunt smaller systems, and the narrative slows just enough to establish their credibility, flying faster than the Scythes and equipped with thermal sensors meant to dominate low visibility conditions, turning the fog into a hunting ground rather than a shield. The first success comes quickly when an Orion's thermal camera catches a brief bloom from one of the Magura V5 boats as it adjusts course, the warm exhaust momentarily painting itself against cold water, and that is all the targeting solution needs, as a KAB-20 guided missile drops from the Orion's wing and strikes the unmanned boat dead center, detonating its 700-pound warhead in a violent column of fire and spray that removes half of Ukraine's surface strike component in an instant. The script emphasizes the psychology of that moment, because from the Russian perspective, it looks like momentum has shifted. One hunter scoring a clean kill against a supposedly clever swarm, yet the environment still refuses to cooperate. As thick fog limits visibility and forces the Orions into a wide-area search they are ill-equipped to conduct, with only 3 aircraft responsible for an entire sector, and the asymmetry reasserts itself quietly rather than explosively. The Ukrainian operator responds by doing something counterintuitive, ordering the last remaining Magura V5 to slow to roughly 20 miles per hour, trading speed for invisibility as it slips into the troughs of 6-foot waves, while the Scythes switch to cold mode, rerouting what little exhaust they produce upward and hugging terrain so closely that the cliffs themselves begin to break up their heat signatures, transforming the hunted into shapes that no longer behave like prey. High above, the Bayraktar's perspective remains unchanged, the fog below appearing as nothing more than a thin blanket, and through that clarity, the operator spots the lead Orion circling in search patterns that betray uncertainty, its coordinates calculated and transmitted downward through Starlink, not as a suggestion, but as an order. And one Scythe receives a new mission that has nothing to do with the harbor and everything to do with removing eyes from the sky. The drone breaks from its path along the cliff line, climbing just enough to align with the Orion's blind rear arc, and the narration leans into the imbalance of the moment. A low-cost plywood airframe, armed with a modest warhead, rising unnoticed toward a multi-million-dollar hunter whose pilot is focused downward, scanning waves for a boat that is deliberately refusing to be found. A geometry that only works once, and therefore must work perfectly. The collision is described as inevitable rather than dramatic, the scythe slamming into the Orion and reducing it to fragments of composite and flame that tumble into the fog. And with that impact, the Russian aerial response loses cohesion, the remaining 2 Orions withdrawing, not because they are damaged, but because they no longer have a clear picture of what they are facing. A retreat driven by uncertainty rather than force. By 4:43 a.m. local time, the operation compresses into its final corridor, with 1 Scythe and 1 Magura 5-5 crossing into the harbor's innermost defensive ring, where the scale of the threat finally triggers shipboard systems, and the Admiral Makarov answers with the mechanical roar of its AK-630 close-in weapon system, a sound defined as 10,000 rounds per minute of 30mm shells, a literal wall of steel thrown into the night. The first burst is devastating, erasing one of the remaining sides in a spray of fragments and tracers. And for a moment, the ship's defenses appear overwhelming, but the script immediately undercuts that impression by introducing the limitations that brochures omit. The finite ammunition drum that empties in seconds, the aging MR-123 radar designed for larger targets, and the simple physics of firing accurately from a $500 million platform rocking several degrees in heavy swell. Small arms fire joins the chaos as sailors fire rifles into the sky, and someone launches a shoulder-fired Verba missile that cannot find a heat source through the fog, while the last Scythe begins a series of violent, computer-assisted jinks, each maneuver calculated to update faster than the CIWS targeting solution can adapt, turning prediction into guesswork at precisely the moment when guesswork is most dangerous for the defender. At the same time, The Magura 5-5, now roughly 10 miles out, releases its final payload of chaff, creating a false radar target that briefly confuses the ship's sensors. And above it all, the Bayraktar designates the final objectives with its laser. Not the bridge or the hull, but the pierside fuel depot, and the 8-caliber missile launch tubes adjacent to it, reframing success away from sinking a ship and toward disabling what makes it strategically relevant. The last scythe punches through the fading wall of the tracers and closes the remaining distance, the script counting down yards rather than seconds as the CIWS ammunition counter races towards zero, and at 4:44 a.m. local time, the drone's camera locks onto its aim point, the fuel depot filling the frame with unsettling clarity, and the narrative pauses on the idea that the next 50 milliseconds will decide whether the entire operation was a gamble or a lesson. The final correction takes place faster than conscious thought, as the drone's onboard system adjusts its course in roughly 50 milliseconds, committing not to the ship itself, but to the infrastructure that keeps it dangerous. And when the scythe impacts the pierside fuel depot, the collision is almost understated compared to what follows, because the warhead is not designed to impress on camera, but to obey physics, focusing its energy inward rather than outward. The 154-pound shaped charge forms a molten copper jet traveling at roughly 8,000 feet per second, a narrow spear of metal that does not blossom into a fireball, but drills forward with precision, punching through a steel wall described as about 1 inch thick, as if resistance were theoretical. And for a brief instant, the damage is invisible, hidden inside the structure where pressure and heat are about to do the real work. What matters happens a little over 1 second later, when ignited fuel begins to spread laterally along the pier and vertically toward the Admiral Makarov, carrying flame and radiant heat rather than fragmentation. And the distinction is crucial because the ship is not being torn apart. It is being cooked, its missile launch systems exposed to temperatures and stress. They were never meant to endure while still loaded and integrated. The script stresses that the ship does not sink, and that this is not a failure but a feature, because sinking would be dramatic but temporary, while disabling the launch mechanisms and guidance systems of 8-caliber cruise missiles achieves something more durable, turning weapons intended for long-range strikes into inert steel tubes that cannot be safely fired or quickly repaired, a transformation far more damaging than a clean hull breach. Around the harbor, the effects compound as burning fuel turns the port of Novorossiysk into a chaotic landscape of smoke, flame, and secondary fires, with piers illuminated by reflections that flicker across warped metal and blackened surfaces. And within that environment, damage control becomes guesswork, because the threat is no longer a single incoming object, but an expanding zone of heat that respects no compartment lines. The Admiral Makarov emerges from the immediate chaos intact enough to remain afloat, yet compromised enough to be operationally irrelevant. Its port side scorched and systems offline, unable to maneuver or project power. And the narrative frames this as a strategic immobilization rather than a tactical hit, because a ship that cannot fire or sail is functionally absent from the order of battle, regardless of whether it remains above water. The timing reinforces the lesson, because the entire sequence from first contact to decisive impact unfolds in roughly 14 minutes, compressing what used to be days of planning and waves of aircraft into a narrow window where decisions are made faster than human intuition can comfortably follow, and where autonomy and preloaded intent matter more than radio control. From the Ukrainian perspective, the material cost is deliberately contrasted with the outcome, described as roughly $1 to $2 million in hardware expended to neutralize a platform valued at roughly $500 million. But the comparison goes beyond price tags, extending to doctrine, because the attack demonstrates that layered defenses optimized for traditional threats can be dismantled by forcing them to fight on too many cognitive fronts at once. The script returns briefly to the human element, not to dwell on individual loss, but to underline how systems shape behavior, with Russian operators reacting logically to the information presented to them, firing at the clearest targets and escalating through their defensive stack, only to find that clarity itself had been engineered as a weakness, and that every correct response fed the next stage of the trap. Equally important is what does not happen afterward, because the port does not immediately return to normal operations, and the Black Sea Fleet does not simply shift its headquarters again with confidence, as the implication is that safety can no longer be assumed anywhere within reach of low-cost systems guided by integrated intelligence, and that relocation alone cannot fix a conceptual vulnerability. The Bayraktar, still circling high above, fades back into the background of the story, its role complete not through firepower, but through persistence and perspective, having served as the quiet backbone that allowed disparate elements to act as a single organism. And the narrative treats this not as a special case, but as a preview of how future engagements are likely to unfold. Attention is given to the psychological dimension as well, because the attack does not rely on surprise alone, but on forcing defenders into a state of perpetual doubt, where every radar contact might be bait, and every silence might hide intent. A condition that erodes confidence over time and makes even heavily defended locations feel provisional rather than secure. The broader implication is framed carefully, avoiding grand declarations while still drawing a clear line between this event and a shift in modern warfare, where inexpensive components, autonomous decision loops, and layered deception can achieve outcomes once reserved for large formations and sustained bombardment, compressing strategic effect into moments rather than campaigns. In that sense, the destruction is almost secondary to the demonstration, because what is proven cannot easily be unproven, and every future defense plan must now account for adversaries willing to trade individual platforms to dismantle entire systems, accepting losses as inputs rather than failures, and designing operations around inevitability rather than attrition. The night at Novorossiysk ends not with a single explosion echoing into silence, but with an altered equation, one where ports, fleets, and fortifications are judged less by their visible strength and more by their ability to cope with uncertainty, and where the absence of invincibility becomes the defining feature of modern naval power. In the minutes immediately following the strike, secondary alarms ripple outward from the harbor as automated safety systems misinterpret cascading sensor failures as fresh attacks, causing bulkheads to seal, pumps to cycle, and fire suppression systems to flood compartments that are no longer burning. A mechanical panic that mirrors the human one unfolding on deck, where crews scramble to interpret conflicting readouts while smoke and heat distort every visual cue, turning standard damage control drills into improvisation under conditions no checklist ever anticipated. Along the pier, the burning fuel continues to behave like a living thing, creeping through drainage channels and pooling in low points before igniting again, sending fresh tongues of flame toward auxiliary power lines and support vehicles. Each flare forcing defenders to pull back further from the ship they are trying to save. And in that forced distance, the irony sharpens, because the very infrastructure meant to support the fleet is now actively denying access to it, transforming the harbor itself into a hostile environment. Inside the Admiral Makarov, engineers isolate the missile compartments only to discover that isolation no longer guarantees safety, as residual heat seeps through structural members and cable runs, warping alignment rails and degrading electronics at a pace that outstrips cooling efforts. And the realization sets in that even if the fires are extinguished, the ship's most valuable systems will require months of depot-level repair, assuming replacement components can even be sourced under wartime constraints. Further out, patrol craft and harbor defense units hold their positions rather than pursue, constrained by the lingering possibility that additional drones or unmanned boats may still be present, a hesitation that underscores the lasting impact of the attack, because the uncertainty outlives the hardware, freezing movement and initiative long after the last explosion fades, and turning what should be a moment of counteraction into one of enforced caution. By the time dawn approaches, the scene has settled into an uneasy stillness, broken only by the crackle of cooling metal and the distant thrum of generators. And while no new strikes arrive, the absence itself feels deliberate, as if the attackers have already achieved their objectives simply by leaving the defenders alone with the consequences. A final reminder that in modern conflict, the most decisive action sometimes ends not with pursuit, but with silence.